Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. This is just a terrific facility. I've been here a few years ago to do some research, and it really is a first-class operation. I'm very pleased to be here. The picture we have here to begin with is a picture that shows the test area at Marshall Space Flight Center in the 60s. I'm going to go back into the 40s and 50s a bit, but this kind of gives us an idea of when Marshall was really at its peak of developing the Saturn rocket. Some of the massive test stands that they had, these were at the time among the largest buildings of any structures really of any sort in the state of Alabama, and they really are even today. That's an awesome thing to look at. I want to go back a little bit though into the 40s and talk about the beginning of the development of the federal presence in Huntsville. Huntsville in 1940 had a population of just over 13,000 people. At the time, the principal industry in Huntsville was the textile industry, and it was definitely in decline. It had done well earlier, but by 1940, it really was in decline. Huntsville was known in some quarters as the watercress capital of the world. So we see this transition from the watercress capital of the world to Rocket City, USA, and that's the story I'll be looking at today. During World War II then, there were two federal arsenals that were developed in Huntsville. One was the Redstone Arsenal, and the other one was Huntsville Arsenal. Both of these were developing ordnance for use in World War II. At the Redstone Arsenal, they were developing their conventional ordnance. At the Huntsville Arsenal, they developed chemical and incendiary ordnance that was used for the war. At the end of World War II, Redstone Arsenal was put on standby. The Army was thinking it might use it for another purpose. But Huntsville Arsenal was closed down and put up for sale. And this is part of the backstory of what led to Marshall Space Flight Center. At the time, already there had been an effort by the federal government to bring some of the former Nazi scientists and engineers to the United States. This was Project Paperclip. And among that group was the group that was led by Wernher von Braun, which came to the United States and went to Fort Bliss in Texas. They came in 1945, and they were there at Fort Bliss doing research, contracting to some American companies. General Electric was one of the main contractors there. And what they were doing is working on some of the V2 parts that were shipped from Germany to the United States at the end of the war, and basically taking steps again to further the development of rocketry in the United States in cooperation with these contractors and with the Army. And they spent 5 years there before they ultimately came to Huntsville. At the time when the issue about what to do with Huntsville Arsenal was still on the books, Senator John Sparkman, who lived in Huntsville, had been bargaining to bring some kind of a federal project to Huntsville. And Huntsville was in competition for a wind tunnel that ultimately went to Tullahoma, Tennessee. Sparkman then struck a deal essentially that, well, the next big project we'd like to have here, and Sparkman certainly had some influence. So when the idea of developing research in the Army on missile development came up, Sparkman pushed for that, and indeed the decision was made to bring that to Huntsville and to use the old Huntsville Arsenal again for that project. And at that point then, the Germans who had been working at Fort Bliss, von Braun and his team, came to Huntsville, and they came in April of 1950. They arrived at Huntsville. Already the Army had established some work on missilery, but these would be the key people at the beginning of that project working in Huntsville. When they came to Huntsville, they became integrated in the Huntsville community pretty early, and this is, I think, one good example of the way in which they became part of the community. Here we see the development of an observatory that the people working for the Army helped to develop. This was not an Army facility, it was something that was used for the city of Huntsville, and von Braun was instrumental in doing it. And later on, in the 60s, when they were working on the Saturn, they developed, along with this facility, with the observatory, they developed a planetarium for which they used one of the top of the dome, essentially, of the Saturn fuel cell that became the dome of the planetarium. So a good deal of cooperation between them and furthering the interest in astronomy and in rocket research as well among the civilian population in Huntsville. Now, after the transfer to Huntsville, the group then became integrated with the Army. They began to work as researchers then in developing rocketry for the Army. And when they did that, they worked under several different organizations, but ultimately the one that became the most important and the one that's most remembered was called ABMA, which stands for the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. And this is the organization that's most remembered while they were still working under the auspices of the Army. It's interesting to see what develops here, because you have a combination now of the Army itself, the American Army, of these Germans who were brought to the United States after World War II, and some young American engineers, many of them who were educated on the GI Bill. Many of them came from Southern universities. There were quite a few of them from Auburn and from Alabama, from Georgia, and they came and were integrated into this group. The mix, of course, led to some interesting differences in their background and consequently differences in their approach. The German training for engineers was much more of a hands-on type of a training than American engineers were trained. American engineering training was more academic. They went to universities, got a degree in engineering. The Germans, though, as part of their training, had to work in some kind of a facility where they got direct hands-on experience. So they implemented that a good deal, and it, again, helped the American engineers to get a different kind of training than they had had in the universities where they had trained. There also was a question about the type of research approach that they would use. And it turned out this was a pretty nice mesh, because the Germans had used an approach that they referred to as everything under one roof. In other words, they would have an organization that basically would take care of this project from the origins, from the development of the project, through its production at the end. And that's what they had done with the V2 in rocketry in Germany during the war, and that's what they were going to develop here. The Army used what can be called the Army Arsenal System, which was really very similar. So it was a nice meeting of the minds, essentially, and they agreed on this approach. So it would be one in which they would be very much in charge of development from the very early stages on through the completion of the development of the project. Ultimately, this came into conflict with other approaches to engineering, and I'll get into that in a little bit as we go on through here, but essentially the debate was between whether you do this all under one roof arsenal system approach, or whether you contract out work to different companies to do some of the work. From the very beginning, again, the Army and then Marshall would contract things out, but they would do most of the developmental work, and really every step along the way they had very closely supervised and been involved in. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The head of all of this, of course, then was Wernher von Braun, and we have a picture here from the 1950s. This is a picture of von Braun is, of course, on the right here. We also have here Holger Toftoy at the top, who was representing the Army, who they worked with at Fort Bliss and in the early years in Huntsville. Later on, General John Medeiros would be the military supervisor of the group, and von Braun would remain, of course, the technical advisor. On the left here, this is Ernst Stuhlinger, who was a scientist. Most of the others were engineers. He was a scientist, and later on, again, he worked through this entire period. He came with the original von Braun team, but later on he became the chief scientist at Marshall Space Flight Center. And then this is Hermann Oberth, and Oberth, this was taken during a visit. He came from Germany and visited, but he was he was kind of a mentor, one of the mentors of von Braun, one of the people that he had admired as a young man, and he looked to him as something of a father figure in terms of his technical development. So this was kind of a reunion when Oberth came to the United States. Looking at another picture here. These are some of the people that were involved with von Braun. We see Ernst Stuhlinger again over here on our left. Von Braun is right here. And on the far right, we have two individuals here. This is Eberhard Rees, who became the deputy to von Braun once Marshall Space Flight Center was set up, and later became his successor once von Braun went on to Washington and worked at Fairchild for a while. Eberhard Rees was his successor as center director at Marshall. And over here, this is Kurt Diebes. Diebes was the head of Marshall's, and the Army's and then Marshall's Launch Operations Directorate at Cape Canaveral. The Cape, before it became an independent center under NASA, it was under the control of the Army in Huntsville, and then Marshall Space Flight Center was one of its directorates, the Launch Operations Directorate. So, and the other men who are shown here are other key lieutenants. Some of them became lab directors once Marshall went into effect as well. So these were some of the key people, the key Germans that worked with von Braun. Now, when they came to Huntsville and worked under the Army, one of the first projects they worked on was the development of the Redstone rocket itself. And here we have what they called the poor man's test stand. The test stands that I showed on the very first slide that you had, kind of the title slide, these were massive, big structures. This was a much smaller one, and this was developed in the mid-50s. It was put together, they called it the poor man's test stand because they had a hard time getting appropriations to build the kind of test stand they really wanted. So they had to kind of shave some money off of other appropriations, essentially, to put this together. They definitely needed a test stand in order to develop the Redstone rocket, and here's what they came up with. This is now a historic structure. I believe it's a U.S. historic site right now, if not it's the state of Alabama, but in any case it has been preserved, and you can see it very much as it was, and it's a much smaller test stand, certainly, than the ones that I showed earlier. Von Braun is a fascinating figure in his own right. He was an excellent engineer, but also became a first-rate manager as well, and really was the manager of this group. He also was a very charismatic leader. He, again, became, without question, the best-known non-astronaut in NASA, once NASA came into existence. But even during the 50s, he became very much a public figure. And much of that was through the fact that he appeared on Walt Disney's television show, Disneyland, the Tomorrowland features that I remember. I'm sure some of you remember this being shown again on that weekly program, Disneyland television program. And he was kind of the instructor, the professor that explained what could happen in terms of flight travel. And again, explained it in ways that students could understand, that grade school students could understand. He also was responsible for a very popular series in Collier's magazine that talked about the future of space flight. There were designs there, and there were a couple of artists that worked on it that were very skilled artists as well. And they had depictions of a future space station, for example. This was always all very futuristic stuff at the time. This is before even our first space satellite was launched. So this seemed very futuristic, but again, it helped to publicize von Braun's vision of the future, and his vision, in a sense, became kind of the American vision because he was such a charismatic and popular. There were those who were jealous of von Braun and a little concerned about the publicity he was getting, and that became an issue as we get into the NASA years as well. But there were some people who expressed some concern about this former Nazi, for example, getting all this publicity. And it would be an issue that von Braun would have to deal with as time went on. Now, as the development went forward, a question became about which branch of the military at the time would be given the priority rights to launch a first American satellite. This was all very public. This was before Sputnik, and we're not aware, of course, of the Russian work on this project. So at the time, the Navy was given the go-ahead, and its Project Vanguard was to be the launch of the first American Earth satellite. The Army, the Air Force, and the Navy all had their own projects, their own missile projects, and they were somewhat in competition. In this case, the Defense Department made the decision that the Navy and its Project Vanguard would be given priority. That meant that at Redstone Arsenal, the Army's project, the ABMA project, had to limit the range of the Redstone rocket that it was working on. Later, again, von Braun would say that they would have been able to launch an Earth satellite much earlier had they been given the go-ahead, but they were given limits as far as the altitude that they would be able to fire this to, and in fact they had to put limits on this. They put sand in it even to limit how high it would go at one point. The Navy then went ahead with its project, and as we well know, the Navy's Vanguard project, these were very public launchings. This was meant to be something that was a demonstration to the world of American skill at rocketry, and the Vanguard project failed. There were several launches that failed, fell back on the launch platform and exploded, and ultimately, again, the project was not able to launch a successful project before the Russians launched Sputnik. On October 4th, 1957, the launch of Sputnik, again, shocked virtually all Americans. We had not believed that the Russians had actually been working on this and were actually ahead of where we were at that point in developing rocketry. It touched off a crisis in the United States. It led to a lot of federal funding for education and science and engineering. And at the time when it was launched, when it was, again, when it began beeping and circling the Earth, the Deputy Defense Secretary, Neil McElroy, happened to be at Redstone Arsenal, and von Braun and some of his lieutenants were sitting at dinner with him and told him that they could launch if they gave him 30 days. And General Medeiros, who was sitting there with him, said, no, 60 days. We needed the extra time just to be sure. So McElroy gave them the go-ahead, and they received, again, the official blessing that they could move ahead and try to launch an Earth satellite then. They would be then given this priority that the Navy had until this point. And this meant, of course, that it went, as they went forward with the development, then this is, again, a later test stand, a bigger test stand here in the development of the Redstone. Ultimately, the rocket that they would use would be, this again is a Redstone booster. They would use a variant of this that was called the Jupiter C. And in fact, the actual launch vehicle that they used for Explorer 1 was a somewhat modified Jupiter C called the Juno. But most people remember it as the Jupiter C, and really that was the fundamental missile. This then, on January 31st, 1958, this is when we have the launch of the first American Earth satellite, Explorer 1. And here's the Jupiter C again, getting ready to be launched. And it was, of course, a successful launch. Here we see, again, three of the people, the key people that were involved in this. And von Braun, of course, is on the right. He was responsible for the rocketry. James Van Allen was the scientist who talked about the Van Allen belt, a radiation belt circling the Earth. And this was one of the issues that the Explorer was to investigate. Explorer was launched as part of the International Geophysical Year, or IGY, in 1957-58, and so it was to be not a military satellite, but rather a civilian project for the satellite itself, for Explorer 1. We're holding up a model here of Explorer 1, and here's a cutaway of that, of the actual satellite itself. We have also, this is in the Huntsville Times, as you can see. This was a great day for Huntsville when this launch was made, as you can well imagine, and we see here the coverage that it received. Huntsville now is really on the map as Rocket City, USA.
What was the date on that?
This is January 31st, 1958. Yeah. And so in any case, the von Braun team then received a real shot in the arm as well from this. And here we see again, this is still during the ABMA days. At this point, this is General Barclay. It was really General Medeiros that was much closer to von Braun. Barclay took over toward the end. But we see here again Eberhard Rees, who was his deputy and later became center director, and of course von Braun himself here. Now, when Explorer 1 was launched, and after Sputnik, there touched off a debate in the United States about the nature of the future of American rocketry. And the real question here was this to be a military project or was it to be a civilian project? And after the launch of Sputnik, and in concert with the International Geophysical Year, President Eisenhower made the decision to develop a civilian space agency. And in July of 1958, NASA became a reality. Now, this touches off a debate at Redstone Arsenal because the von Braun group is still part of the Army, and the Army was not eager to let go of the von Braun group, and for some time there was a debate. What happened is when NASA was formed, what was called the Space Task Group, which was a group that had been operating at Langley in the Washington, D.C. area, now moved to Texas, and there established what was called the Manned Spacecraft Center. Later, this would be Johnson Space Center. At the time, it was the Manned Spacecraft Center, and it was the biggest center at the time then within NASA. And von Braun's group is still with the Army, and von Braun would have liked to go to the civilian agency earlier, but he did feel a good deal of loyalty to General Medeiros, who had kind of protected them within the Army. And it was not his call anyway. It was really the Army's call and NASA's call and the President's call, ultimately, and his technical and space advisors. And ultimately, the decision would be made, and the von Braun group would then join NASA And Marshall Space Flight Center then absorbed some of the facilities that had been used at Redstone Arsenal, and it became then in 1960, in July 1960, it became one of the centers of the new NASA. So with that transition, things changed, but not everything changed, of course. There was a question of what was the role then of military rocketry? Would that continue? And the Air Force in particular had a pretty strong program. And there were questions then about, the questions that arose at this point were questions such as, should you use solid rocket fuel or liquid fuel? This became an important issue because the German team was totally committed to liquid fuel. And there were several very good reasons for that. One of them was that it was much easier to test if you used liquid fuel because you could shut down the test at some point if you needed to do that. And you could isolate parts that you maybe had trouble with. With solid fuels, the problem, the way that solid fuels operated in the 60s and into the 70s was that once you lit it off, it was like lighting off a firecracker, essentially, is a parallel that they used often. Once you lit it, you didn't shut it down. It just fired, and it was harder to pinpoint exactly where there might have been error. The German team and their German tradition, and the one that they had instilled at Redstone Arsenal and then at Marshall Space Flight Center, was the notion of testing to failure. You test something until it fails, and then you can pinpoint what was wrong. They could also isolate parts of the rocket engines then to find out where the failure was, and they could test over and over again. It was much harder to get that kind of a very specific test aimed at specific components if you're using solids. So they were committed to liquids. They were also committed to this all under one roof development, and the Air Force, for example, used contracting much more. They would contract out much of what they did. One example of how much the Germans at Marshall put into testing and so forth, I can give you one example. At one point, the Air Force had been developing the Centaur rocket. That project was transferred to Marshall Space Flight Center once Marshall was established. And while the Air Force had supervisory responsibility of Centaur, it had 8 officials monitoring this test. When it came to Marshall, Marshall assigned 140. So again, you can see the intense concentration they did on monitoring absolutely every aspect of this test as it went along. Now, President Eisenhower had his doubts about putting a lot of money into space and so forth. He was very reluctant to do that, and didn't want to get into a race to the moon with the Russians, didn't want to get into a race to put in more satellites into space. He preferred to go rather a little bit more conservatively on this, and one of the NASA officials would later say Ike was no space cadet. And he really had reservations about this. It cost so much is one of the things, one of the concerns that he had. There are also concerns that that people were discussing at the time. One of the issues was that the United States was using high-flying aircraft called the U-2. And some of you remember, of course, the U-2 incident that happened late in the Eisenhower administration. But the U-2 was flying over Soviet territory and taking photographs in the 50s before it was shot down in 1960. And essentially, one of the things that Eisenhower realized is that once the Soviets launched that satellite, it would be traveling over American airspace. So it would lessen the likelihood that the Soviets would protest American vehicles or later American spacecraft flying over their territory. And if they were ahead of us in rocketry, we were definitely ahead of them in photography. And aerial photography, we were far ahead of where they were and could take photographs that were much more revealing. And Eisenhower realized that and realized the value of this now that again, the question of flying over airspace would not be a question after Sputnik. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Eisenhower had his reservations, though, about all of this money that might be poured into technology of this sort. And in his farewell address in January of 1961, one of the most famous speeches he gave, he said, quote, "We must guard against the acquisition of an unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex." He also in that speech talked about his concerns about the, quote, "scientific-technological elite," unquote. Later, when Eisenhower was questioned about that, he said that the people he had in mind then were Edward Teller, who was pushing the development early of the hydrogen bomb and beyond that, developing atomic weaponry, and Wernher von Braun. So again, von Braun was in his mind when he wrote that speech, again, that became one of the most famous speeches that Eisenhower gave. Now, during the late months of the Eisenhower administration, of course, the presidential campaign was underway. Senator Kennedy from Massachusetts was campaigning and complaining about the missile gap, complaining that we were far behind the Russians. As it turned out, again, that missile gap, one Rand Corporation official, Daniel Ellsberg, as it turned out, became famous for the Pentagon Papers. At one point around this time, he was giving a briefing, and this is in the era before PowerPoint. They had flip charts, and he had a flip chart and flipped over the first one and said, "Yes, Virginia, there is a missile gap." He flipped over the next one and said, "It is 10-1. Flipped over the next page, and it said, "In our favor." So actually, the United States, in terms of the missile gap, we were really ahead. Kennedy was not lying. Based on some of the information that had put out, many people believe that we were way behind. It turned out that we weren't, but once Kennedy was in office, he was committed to missile development. And certainly, again, NASA gave him a venue for that. What Kennedy would say, and let me just move ahead here a little bit. Again, this is the Juno, it's essentially the modified Redstone that I mentioned before. Again, one of the issues became the Saturn rocket. The Saturn was the propulsion system for Apollo, the moon program that the United States had in the 1960s. And that was developed here. And this is one of the reasons that the Army decided to part with the von Braun group, because this was going to be a terribly expensive project, developing the Saturn rocket. It was an enormous rocket, much bigger than anything that had been built before of this sort. And the Army felt it couldn't afford that and didn't really have a use for it. So NASA did. NASA wanted to go to the moon, of course. And this, again, you can see the size here. You see some people in the bottom. Go back here. Just you see some of the men down here, and the size of these Saturn rockets. This is just the first stage of the Saturn. It was an enormous craft, of course, when it was built. And again, here we see one of the launches of, this is not of the Saturn V, it's, again, as you see, the Saturn SA-1, which is one of the stages of the Saturn eventually that would be developed later. Now, okay, this is, again, let's see, I have a slide here of President Kennedy that I wanted to get to, and I think if I'm getting out of sequence, I apologize here. Okay, here we're almost there. All right, here's President Kennedy with Wernher von Braun. He came to Marshall, as it says in September 11th, 1962. Kennedy gave two speeches in which he talked about what our plans would be for the future. And the most famous one, of course, is one that he gave in May of 1962. He said, quote, "I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." Then in September of 1962, the same month in which he visited Marshall, he gave a speech at Rice University in Houston, and he said then, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." And so again, if Eisenhower wasn't behind this, Kennedy was, and Kennedy committed the nation again to the Apollo program. And this is what really led to the glory years at Marshall. Building the Saturn V was the major achievement, of course. This is the propulsion system of the Apollo project, of all of the launches again that were targeting the moon. And this was done at Marshall. All the research was done here. There were tests of the Saturn rockets in Huntsville in the 1960s that just shook the town. Again, people that were there in the 60s still describe that being in their homes several miles from where these test stands were, they could feel the earth shaking. It was as if there were an earthquake, and this enormous loud sound as well. So it was a pretty incredible experience for the people there at the time. It also, again, by that time, by the 60s, we see this very rapid rate of growth of Huntsville, because you have not only the Army still there at Redstone Arsenal and NASA, but you have a lot of contractors that are coming to town that are working on various aspects of both Army projects and NASA projects. I mentioned that Huntsville in 1940 had about 13,000 people. In 1950, it had about 16,000. By 1960, it jumped up to over 72,000. And by 1967, which was really the peak of work on Saturn, it was actually a bit past the peak, Huntsville's population was 143,000. So you can see this period from 1950 until 1967, especially, enormous rate of growth in Huntsville. In 1945, in Huntsville, there were 12 different industries and 3,500 homes existing in Huntsville. In 1964, there were 40 industries and 30,000 homes in Huntsville. The per capita income in Huntsville, in 1960, Huntsville was at about 50% of the national average. By 1967, it was up to 80% of the national average. So again, in many different ways, this was really helping Huntsville to grow. We see this old debate then coming to life once again, the debate between the arsenal system used at Marshall and the contracting system that the Air Force used. And eventually the government would push more and more toward the contracting system, and there were a number of reasons for this. For one thing, it was very expensive to do the kind of research that the von Braun team liked to do. Again, having all of these monitors and the Centaur is one example. Again, it's very intensive work that's done. It requires a lot of people and a lot of employment. So again, if you contract this out, you make the contractor responsible. The other advantage of contracting out is you can put business all over the country. Again, virtually every state would have a little piece of NASA business anyway during the Apollo program. And so this hopefully would commit them again to appropriations for NASA, because they'd not only be helping in this national vision of the race to the moon, but also be helping their own domestic industries in their own states. The disadvantage of this, and Marshall felt this in particular, is that when you begin to contract things out, you can't do what you had done before. And that is, it's not that they didn't have contractors before, they did, but they had by that time developed the system and knew it inside out. So when you contracted out, they could do, as they described it, they could penetrate the contractors. They'd have their people on site in the contracting companies, and they knew the system better than the contractor did. As time went on and as NASA moved more and more to contracting, and as we get into shuttle development, for example, years later, NASA and Marshall in particular lost that ability to penetrate the contractors to that extent. The contractor knew more about the system than the Marshall engineers that would go there, because it had been developed at the contractor rather than at Marshall. And this was a weakness of NASA as time went on, because it gained the political benefits of contracting out and farming this out all over the country, but it lost the ability to penetrate a contractor as it had done in the 1960s under Apollo. Okay, one thing I wanted to say a little bit about too is the relationship between the Manned Spacecraft Center, which became Johnson Space Center in Houston, and Marshall. The Johnson Space Center was very different in its atmosphere, in its approach to things than Marshall. Yet the two centers had to work together. During Apollo, from 1960 up through about 1967, the centers were almost exactly the same size, has the same number of employees within a few. They received approximately the same appropriation. They were on a similar footing. There was a lot of rivalry between the two centers. Again, competition for different pieces of the project, for example, but they also had to work together. So it was an interesting relationship. There had to be some give and take between them. When people from Marshall visited Houston and vice versa, when people from Houston visited Marshall, they had very different impressions of what was going on in each center. When people from Marshall went to Houston, they thought that when there were presentations given that they were inadequately prepared. The Marshall people would go over them again and again and again before they present them. The people from Houston, they felt kind of just prepare these on the way to Huntsville. They thought there wasn't enough rigor at Houston. They thought that when they visited it, that it was more like a college campus than a research facility. And again, so the difference in their impression. When people from Houston came to Huntsville, they saw von Braun as a dictator. They saw Marshall as more like a military base than a research facility. And they thought that Marshall was too territorial. It was trying to protect its turf more so than was really productive for NASA at large. Houston got the rights to train the astronauts. So there was a lot more attention focused on Houston than there was on Marshall and Huntsville. And there was some resentment of that in Huntsville as well. Once the astronaut corps was selected, Life magazine had cover features, several of them on them, and astronauts really had a lot of the focus. So as time went on, again, Huntsville began to resent that a little bit. But they did have to work together, and they found ways to do that. And where there were interfaces between the capsule, where the astronauts were to be, and the rocketry developed at Huntsville, this went smoothly. They knew they had to do it, and they did work together and did cooperate. But there were strains as well. Another issue is the management system at Marshall. And this is one of the things that von Braun was really lauded for. He developed a system called the weekly notes. And the weekly notes were just that. They were notes that each of the labs at Marshall had to submit to the director, the center director, von Braun. And he would read through the notes, and basically they told what they had done during the last week. He'd make notations on those notes and send them back. And he wanted responses from each of these labs to his questions, to the questions he posed. So it became a way that he became very much aware of what was going on everywhere in the center. He didn't have to go around to the center, although he certainly did that as well, and people everywhere got to know him. There are interesting stories about one individual was working on cables under one of the test stands and was down there full of grease and everything, and he was looking at what he was doing. He couldn't really look away because it was work that he had to keep his eyes on. And somebody came up behind him, he said, "Here, let me help you with that." And he'd help pull it out and everything. And he was somewhat into this before he realized it was von Braun that had actually gotten down there and gotten grease in his hands and helped him to do this. And this is part of that hands-on tradition, again, as well as being, I think, something kind of indicative of who Wernher von Braun really was. There is one other thing I'd like to say something about, too, that became very important in terms of Marshall's contribution to really the state of Alabama. And this touches on the issue of civil rights. The Kennedy administration and then the Johnson administration both put a lot of pressure on Marshall to do something about hiring black engineers, for example. This was, again, because they were trying to put pressure, of course, on Alabama itself to do things in terms of progress in civil rights. And as it turned out, again, largely because of that federal presence, through the pressure brought to bear on Marshall itself, threatening to transfer projects out of Alabama if Marshall didn't make progress, Marshall tried to do this. And just move ahead here a little bit further again. Okay, these are, again, some Saturn photos, and we'll come back to that, but I wanted to get to this. This is, of course, George Wallace visiting the Marshall Space Flight Center. And at one point, George Wallace, again, touring around, walking around the center with von Braun and some of the others. One of von Braun's lieutenants said to Wallace, would you like to go to the moon? And Wallace's reply was, well, I'm afraid you fellows wouldn't bring me back, is what he said. So in any case, but what happened is that contractors in Huntsville were very much aware that if they didn't make progress in civil rights, that business might be transferred away. And there was an organization that contractors in Huntsville formed. It's called the Association of Huntsville Area Contractors, or AHAC. And what they did is to help von Braun and help the other leaders at Marshall to try to do something about integrating the Space Center. It was very difficult to do because, of course, in the late 60s, to attract black engineers trained elsewhere in the country to come to Alabama was a pretty hard sell, as you can imagine. And so Marshall always fell behind NASA's goals in terms of hiring African Americans. And von Braun did make a full effort to do so, and I think they recognized that he was doing that. But it was a sore point, and it was a point of pressure. But it was one of the reasons that Huntsville and North Alabama experienced less tension in terms of civil rights than did much of the rest of the state. And one example of that is at the time when George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama to prevent integration there, a couple of days later, University of Alabama in Huntsville admitted its first black student, and it was not a major issue. It happened fairly smoothly. And that's largely because of the federal presence and the threats that both the Kennedy and Johnson administration posed to Marshall, the danger of losing some of that business. Okay, let me talk a little bit about one other issue, because after the development of Saturn, that was really what Marshall's responsibility was under Apollo. It was to develop the propulsion system, and that's what the Saturn rocket was. It completed that work in the mid-60s, and meanwhile, Houston was still working on the capsule, for example, that would be used. So Saturn is fully developed, it's in production, and Marshall begins to decline because they begin to take some of the business away. It achieved its major goal. And the late 60s were difficult for Marshall because it has cuts in funding, it has rifts or reductions in force, which means that people are being let go. There was a lot of pressure brought to bear on the Germans, who were the senior lab directors, and many of them were either forced to take a reduction in their assignment. The NASA decided it wanted to bring some of these younger American engineers into these positions. There continued to be some of that resentment about the Nazi past of von Braun and the other Germans who had come with him. And so Marshall was really under fire in a number of ways. And what Marshall did at that point, and this was a key point in Marshall's development, Marshall made a decision then that what it had to do is it no longer could simply be NASA's propulsion center. It had to diversify. It had to get involved in many other things. And it got involved then in space science. It got involved in virtually anything that they could latch onto, that they could propose projects for. And this had very important consequences later. A couple of examples of what it meant later on. Late in the 70s, there was a discussion at NASA headquarters about closing Marshall. And one of the reasons that they talked about closing Marshall is that yes, Marshall had diversified, but one of the consequences of that is that everything Marshall did could be done somewhere else. And that's one of the reasons they considered closing Marshall. And at that point, they made the decision not to, but that threat was always kind of in the air as they moved forward, and especially as NASA funding decreased in the 80s and in the 90s. One of the benefits of this, though, of course, is that Marshall now could compete for many different kinds of projects, and it did so successfully in many cases. Diversification, while it maybe put them at risk in some cases, also saved them in other ways, because Marshall became so diversified that it really did make pioneering breakthroughs in many other areas. And some of the work in other satellite systems, for example, that were developed later, work on shuttle, work also on Space Lab, for example. Marshall did a lot of work on Space Lab. So these sorts of things gave the advantage of that, but it also meant, the other thing it meant is we were competing with other centers. Marshall competed with other NASA centers for business. And when it competed with these other centers, when it came to the threat of closing Marshall, Marshall had no allies because we had gone head-to-head with them. Marshall had gone head-to-head with them in competing for these projects. And in terms of the future of the other centers, if Marshall were to be closed, they'd have less competition to get some of those projects that were more in their area of specialization. So it kind of cut both ways. But I think one of the things it shows that in the post-Saturn era, Marshall really was faced with real challenges, and it responded to them in a very effective way in terms of diversifying, but that had its costs too. So in any case, let me just jump on ahead here. This, again, one of the things that happens later, here we have Senator Stennis from Mississippi. Some of the testing, as Marshall goes through this transition, is moved elsewhere. Some of it is moved to Mississippi, to Michoud and to Stennis Center in Mississippi, some of the things that had been done at Marshall before. Von Braun, as you can see from this picture again, was a good politician. He kept in contact not only with John Sparkman in Huntsville, but again with John Stennis in Mississippi. During the Johnson administration then, President Johnson, as you see here, also visited Marshall Space Flight Center. And you see him here with von Braun on your left, and James Webb on the right. And Webb was a key figure. He's the one who was, he was the administrator of NASA during these key years of the Apollo project. And he's the one who came to Huntsville and told them that you have to do something about progress in civil rights or we're going to move these projects to other states. So he was, in a sense, kind of the messenger of bad news to Huntsville, but it did have a positive consequence in the long run. President Johnson was certainly carried on, as he did in many other things that President Kennedy had proposed, and certainly in the lunar project, President Johnson was as much of a supporter as President Kennedy had been before him. Okay, this is a shot then of from the top of the gantry during the launch of one of the Apollo shots. This is, I think, one of the particularly dramatic shots that you see here of a launch of the Saturn. This is just a year or so before the Apollo launch that actually did land Neil Armstrong on the moon. So this really kind of concludes the 60s, and Marshall then would go forward into the 70s and 80s and still became a crucial part of NASA. NASA today is facing funding restrictions, as we well know. And the annual funding, when it comes up, Marshall isn't usually in direct threat of being closed down, but many of Marshall's projects have been lost as have lost funding. And NASA's future is much less certain, certainly today, than it was back in the 60s, the heyday of Marshall, the heyday of Saturn, and really the glory years of Marshall. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
We have time for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand, and I will give you the microphone to speak into so that the rest of the audience can hear your question.
Yes, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Your earlier part of your presentation raises a question. Maybe what was it? You're a historian. Perhaps you'd have a readily given opinion on this. Is it perhaps mainly an historical accident that there was a successful missile program with the German scientists? Did they, in effect, did they simply bring us a play and the Americans ran with the ball and scored the touchdown? Or could have American engineers have developed the same thing if we'd gone in a different direction? Was it a peculiarly German development, or what's your feeling?
I think that the Germans added a lot to an American program that the Americans were going to pursue anyway. In all likelihood, Americans could have developed it. In all likelihood, not as soon as they did. I think von Braun's leadership really was very important in the propulsion system, and that, of course, was one of the real keys to the successful lunar program. And I think the fact that the Germans were there, they had more experience than any of the Americans did, and that experience was put to good use. One of the questions at the launch of Sputnik was the way that people often looked at this was, well, were their Germans better than our Germans? Because they had also taken a lot of the German engineers back to Russia, and they had been crucial also in the development of the Russian space program. So both relied on, again, the Germans that had been involved in rocketry in Germany during World War II. And yes, I think we would have developed this, but it would have probably taken longer.
I was going to raise the same point about the Russians and Americans saying our Germans are better than
Right.
your Germans. I knew the daughter of one of the German scientists, and she didn't come over right after the war, but a few years later when they were still at Fort Bliss.
Yes.
And she said because the German scientists had been brought over as POWs,
Yeah.
they couldn't become citizens
Right.
without entering the country legally. So they put them all on a bus, drove them into Mexico,
Yep.
had them cross the border as immigrants, and then they could get citizenship that way.
Yeah, exactly. So they were illegal immigrants. Okay? So, and that's how they formalized it. Yes, they took them into Mexico. They were at Fort Bliss near El Paso, took them across the border, brought them back. Then when they came to Huntsville, actually most of them did become American citizens, and there was a big ceremony in Huntsville, I think it was 1954, in a high school gym there where they had a ceremony where they became American citizens. But to be legal immigrants, they had to cross into Mexico and come back. You're right, yeah.
With these cutbacks, the budget in recent years, what do you see with the space program in the next 10, 20 years? What can be done up at Huntsville and NASA?
Well,
What kind of programs? You just look in your crystal ball.
Okay, well, historians don't like to look in the crystal ball. I'm reluctant to do that for more than one reason. For one thing, historians do look at the past and are very reluctant to predict the future because they're not very good at it, and I'd have to join that group. But the other thing is I really haven't followed it as closely as I did when we were working on this book, and the book went up to 1990. Being in Huntsville, again, you're aware of some of the things that are going on, and they have had cutbacks in some programs. It's really very much dependent on the support of the American people and whether the American people really want more of this. And in recent years, after Apollo and after the moon landings, again, people kind of lost interest in this. The public generally lost interest, and that's part of the reason that NASA hasn't had the funding that it would like to have. And Shuttle became interesting when the first launches of Shuttle, of course, that was very much followed by the American public. And when there were key events in the Shuttle programs, some of the walks in space, for example, people were very excited about that, but it didn't sustain the interest as the lunar program did in the 1960s. So the relative decline in public interest in the space program is one of the things that has cost NASA its support. And again, if we're to look to the future, do we have a program as exciting as that lunar program was? I think if we have a goal, again, and President Bush suggested a program of going to Mars, well, that hasn't gone very far. It hasn't had the funding. nor the public support. The kinds of things that NASA is doing now, not having human space flight, but rather having launches again of some of these satellites that bring back absolutely stunning photographs. But that's not as exciting as when you have people going into space, okay? So I think those are the real questions that NASA faces, the question of how to generate the kind of excitement that they had in the 1960s with the lunar program, but also the question of whether the public really does support these sorts of things. And yes, there is. There's a segment of the public that's very excited by the things that are going on now and some of these spectacular photographs that are coming back from space and the new discoveries and what this all means. But it doesn't have the same broad public appeal that the lunar program had in the 1960s. And whether we can regain something like that, it's hard to envision something right now that would capture the entire public's excitement as the lunar program did in the 1960s. I think there will continue to be support for NASA and what it does because it's doing important things and it is making exciting discoveries. But yet again, the fact that we are right now without a real launch system for several years speaks to that fact. There doesn't seem to be that much concern on the part of the public about that. And again, there was a project underway that was canceled at the point at which we were hoping to get the next launch system going. And now it's some years down the road before we'll even have another launch system. And nobody seems terribly troubled by that, I think, outside of the NASA community, I guess you could say. So right now, it's hard to envision what will get this really going. I think NASA will continue to do the kinds of research it is doing. It's not that they won't do that. But again, they would like to do more, and they need more money to do that. And in the current economic environment, it's hard to see where that will come from until we begin to turn the corner economically once again and our economy recovers, and then perhaps they can gain a little bit more funding. Yes. Yep.
What was the ultimate resolution of the Nazi criticism?
Okay, there are a number of things that happened there. There was some criticism that came toward von Braun, again, from some French citizens who had been in some of the tunnels in Germany building the rockets, and that broke around 1960. There was also criticism within NASA, and some of the key people in NASA were concerned about the publicity that von Braun was receiving. Abe Silverstein, for example, was the director of Lewis Space Center. He was Jewish, and he, as we can understand, had a lot of resentment about bringing Nazis into the American space program. There were others at headquarters as well that were concerned about that, and one of the things that James Webb did, he had his photo up as NASA administrator, one of the things he did is he wanted von Braun to clear all of his speeches and to limit the number of public speeches that he would give. So there was a limit on the number and on the substance of those talks for some time. So there were limits placed on him in that regard. There's also a feeling in Huntsville anyway that Marshall was in some cases forced to take a second citizen position behind Houston, and not only because of the astronauts were there, but because of this implied concern about not having a Nazi who's heading the American space program, or in this key role in the American space program. And one example of the consequences of that, and there are a number of things that can be looked to, but one of the consequences of that was a question about the way in which we would get to the moon. And there were two different proposals. One was called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, and the other one was called Earth Orbit Rendezvous, or EOR or LOR. Earth Orbit Rendezvous is what Marshall and von Braun were proposing. And it had some advantages in the sense that it would lead, you'd have, again, a missile that would be circling the Earth, and it might have become the forerunner of an early space station, and then the launch from there to the moon. Or you have, again, the capsule circuit, which we should eventually use. But there was a big showdown meeting over which one to choose. Houston supporting Lunar Orbit Rendezvous and Marshall supporting EOR. And at a crucial point in that debate, von Braun stood up and said, Marshall has decided to support Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, which was a Houston preference. Many of the people who worked with him were astonished that he did that he didn't keep pressing. And those who feel that he, again, there was a logic to each one and a good argument for each one. But von Braun, realizing, I think, the position he was in, that at some point he probably was going to lose this argument if it was based on Houston versus Marshall. And he chose to back down at that case. So I think that was another consequence. Again, we don't have anything that documents that he did it for that reason, but it seems that just the environment in which that debate went on, that likely that was certainly in his mind. So those are some of the consequences of it. Ultimately, there's nothing more overt than limiting his speeches and sort of a lingering criticism that was in the air. But again, there were consequences to it, and I think it was in the atmosphere, especially with Abe Silverstein at Lewis. He clearly expressed that on a number of occasions, his concerns about the power and influence that von Braun had in NASA. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one question, one more question.
I had the good fortune, I guess, once of flying out of Huntsville, seated next to Dr. Reese.
Ah, yeah.
And in our introductory conversation of, you know, our names and what do you do, he said to me, when I explained that I had sat on the Teacher in Space Committee, he said, well, I can assure you that if Dr. von Braun had been in charge, that would have never happened. And I think I heard you say something today, and this is my question, about the debate between the liquid and solid fuels, and he went into a lengthy explanation of which I did not understand one word. But did you perhaps explain that to me today in very simple layman's language, that he was telling me that that debate over the liquid versus solid fuel would have been the difference in that explosion or not?
Which explosion you're speaking of, the Challenger?
Of the Challenger.
Yeah. Well, okay, and of course, Marshall was right at the center of that investigation because they had, of course, been developing, and they used solid rocket boosters again for that. The reason that they believe that they should have stayed with liquids is because of the ability to do much more testing and to break down different components of a rocket engine, again, that was fueled by a liquid fuel. It's much harder to do that with a solid fuel, and that was their concern, and that's why they wanted to stay with liquids, and were urging staying with liquids. So I think that would be the argument that they would make, and there's some merit to it because the process that you can go through in testing is much more rigorous with liquids than it would be with solids. In some sense, there's more that can go wrong with liquids too, because there are more components that it's a more complicated rocket engine than the solids are. So I think the people who defend solids would make that other argument, that it is not as complicated a system as a liquid rocket engine is. So there would be an argument on both sides. Their argument, and they could certainly defend it based on their performance during Apollo, is that if you thoroughly test this, you can really break it down to the point that you really can have much more confidence in a liquid-fueled rocket engine than you can in a solid. But again, those who defend solids have their perspective and their viewpoint on this as well. It's hard to say whether it would have happened or not. When you're dealing with something as complicated as rocketry and as technically sophisticated, it means that inevitably you're going to have a failure somewhere along the line. And I think everybody that worked on this, from the astronauts through the people that were involved in development, realized that at some point it was certainly conceivable that there would be an accident. And I think when it happened, it was certainly a shock, but I think everybody that was involved in that program realized that there were risks involved, and you could never be 100% certain that there would not be a failure. So,
Thank you,
okay,
Dr.
yeah.
Dunar. Dr. Dunar will be here for a few minutes if you would like to have questions for him or would like to speak with him. Thank you so much for coming today and turn in evaluations. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.